But Dan, as we know, herbicide use is probably the most common way that we combat weeds today, especially with these common chemicals that we have that are so prevalent, like Roundup or glyphosate, glufosinate, or Liberty. But could you give us a rundown on some of these key strategies for effectively controlling these weed populations with herbicides, but specifically some practices and management tools to avoid herbicide resistance?
Sure. Thanks, Isaiah. And, there's a lot of things, as Isaiah just talked about, that goes into weed control and management and just getting the best performance from our chemicals that we're using. And one thing that I think we need to be thinking about here is we don't want to rely on a certain chemical for far too long, because we need to be changing up our modes of action so that we can control some of these weeds. We need to make certain that the products that we're using and the weeds that we're trying to control are actually listed on that label, because, I go back and I look at some of the things that I did back in the 80s with some lawn care, and we did some things with controlling some creep and Charlie that product worked very well, but it probably wasn't labeled for that. And so we just want to make certain that we're using products for what they're labeled for, that we are reading the label, because the label is basically the guideline of how to use that product. And that chemical label always takes precedence over any adjuvant label that we're looking at and considering. If that chemical label is specifying that you have to use a certain amount of a certain type of adjuvant, that's what we need to use and follow, because those chemical manufacturers are going to know what that rate is for their chemical, and also what rate and what type of surfactant is going to be needed. So we want to make certain that we're doing that. And we don't want to spray atrazine on soybeans or glyphosate on conventional corn and do some of those things where, we know some of those issues are going to lead to problems and lead to those issues. And I think there are some things that we want to look at too. We want to try to control those weeds when they're as small as possible, because if they go to seed, our problem has just multiplied. If we're using and trying to cut back on costs, maybe we're trying to reduce the rate of that chemical that we're using. That's going to lead to some potential aspects of resistance that Isaiah was talking about that we want to make certain that we're avoiding. So there's multiple modes of action. There's pre-emerge or residual herbicides that are going to prevent the seeds from germinating. And if you think about that, if you're keeping up with your lawn, you might think of a product like Dimension. You might think of other pre-emerge chemicals that are going to kind of put a barrier out there and not let seeds germinate that are undesirable. And so that's an opportunity to use those pre-emerge or residual herbicides and utilize some products with that. And the likelihood the weeds are going to become resistant when you're using multiple herbicides is much less likely to develop into resistant issues. And we want to make certain that, as I mentioned, that we're using the correct adjuvant. And there's several different herbicides on the market that, you may be able to tank mix together, but you also have to look at, are they requiring and calling for a similar adjuvant, or which one takes precedence over which? So we need to, again, make certain that we do read that label, and not doing so may impact the performance of